Hi, everyone. My goodness, it's already week 4. Welcome to this week. This is the week about bias. So I just have a few announcements and then I'll explain what we're doing in this module. So just a reminder again that we have a couple of ongoing discussions. One is more important than the other right now. It's about research because it is pointing towards week 6. So we are going to be basing a lot of what we do in week 6 on your actual questions about research. Research is such a huge topic and there's so many things that we could cover that we really wanted to home in on some of the things that you really want to know. So please take a moment as you dive into some of your first assignments to put in the discussion some questions that you have for the librarian so that we can include that in week 6 in her video. The other one is the continuing ask and answer discussion. I noticed that no one has contributed there yet. It's probably still very early, but that's a place where you can ask questions of topics that we have not covered or don't look like they're going to be in the syllabus that you would like included or that you would even just like us to post some resources for. It doesn't have to generate any extra work on your part, but things that we'd like us to provide you with. Along those lines, the answer part is it's a place for you to post things that maybe you came across from your supervisor or something that you found in the process of researching something that you think that you'd like to share with the rest of the class because it was really helpful to you. So if you'd like to post them there for people to see, definitely do that. And in the future, we may be adding that to our ongoing resource library folder. We are still trying to figure out, if we're giving you enough work or too much work. So, putting those things in the discussions, if you do end up having to fall behind or you lose some points because things were later on in the semester, that's a really great way to make up some points. So it isn't for nothing to do that, even though I do think it also creates a nice community among us since we don't see each other in person. I'm trying to find ways for everybody to at least interact a little bit so it seems like we're a real class together. So please do use those. And of course, always reach out to me directly if you have any ideas or concerns that you don't want to share with everyone. I'm always available. My office hours and contact information are in the syllabus. And some of you have been to my office. It's a really nice place. I always have snacks. And so just come by and chat sometime. Okay, so we've got bias. It just so happens that this week coincides with the week that the clinical program has rolled out their anti-racism module. And some explanation about that, there are some new guidelines and actually requirements by the ABA that governs legal education. It's called 303C, that require us to provide a certain amount of anti-racism programming to every law student. And because we are part of the experiential program and share space with the clinics, it made sense for us to roll this out all at once to everybody. And so you'll see those materials. There's a pretty simple reflection assignment there. There's some amazing things to read, so I encourage you to dive into those. The time that you spend on that module will count for this class, so do put it in Clio. And it will be graded. I believe it's 1 point, but definitely it will be reviewed by the clinical faculty. So go ahead and do that. That is due on the 26th at midnight, as is the reflection from this week. We didn't plan it that way. I just happened to have bias as my 4th week, but they do work together very well. So let me talk about how these things work together. So the anti-racism module is very much geared towards what it sounds like, an anti-racism set of readings and resources, which are critically important right now. And I think that you'll get a lot out of them. When I was contemplating doing a similar week, I wanted to take an approach that would complement a lot of the programming that I knew that you would probably be getting in other places on anti-racism and look more at the concept of bias in a bigger way. It's kind of just my way of thinking about things. I do like to sort of zoom out and think about, okay, these are micro problems or these are specific problems. Let's go out to the macro level and figure out what is going on. What is the big problem? How can we approach things like anti-racism in the sense of there's a big thing called bias, and let's talk about what that is. So that's what we're doing this week. It's going to get a little bit more philosophical or sort of data driven, but don't be scared about that. I don't mean that in a hard way, but I've really broken this into sort of two parts. And so the easiest way to think about it is that there's a few articles, there's 3 articles that aren't very long, and they're really not very hard to read, that talk about bias as a concept. And not really in terms of specifically racism at all, but more in terms of a cognitive process that we all do. And then there's a second half that has some videos that I want you to comment on, and that's going to be talking about bias as it's applied to our behavior and our reactions and what we can do to self-regulate as these things happen. And I think that's really critically important. So the basic idea about bias is for lawyers, bias, is sort of the opposite of critical thinking. And if you think about what lawyers do, it's really our job to dive into the facts and sort of really look as objectively as possible at situations. Otherwise, we're in charge of justice, right? That's our realm. And so we will do injustice if we fall victim to being too biased. In a pure sense, bias is really built into our brain. So it's something that as higher thinkers, we struggle against because we sort of have an animal lizard brain that is really ancient from when, we would be hunter-gatherers and we'd walk through a field and we'd see something, green and tubular, and we'd run because it was probably a snake, right? And we didn't have time to sit there and look at it and see what the markings were and whether it had eyes. We just saw green tube in the grass, run. And so that really is still there. So we knee-jerk reaction to a lot of things that give us stimulus. But now we really have moved on in our evolutionary and cultural growth so that we could sort of look at it and go, oh, wait, that was just a hose. Yeah, I was just watering my grass. I forgot to put my hose away. That thing isn't a snake. It's a garden hose. And so we have that time to stop and examine what it was that gave us the knee-jerk reaction. We're still going to do that. If it's twilight and you see something slithery looking in your grass, you're probably initially going to get a rush of adrenaline and a very ancient urge to run away from it until you stop and think, well, that's dumb. I bet that's my hose. That first knee-jerk reaction is still there. It's vestigial. And so a lot of people beat themselves up for having that knee-jerk reaction when they have a stimulus and they have a reaction to it. And the idea of bias is to not get rid of that. You may not be able to, but to really have the wherewithal to then examine it, to notice that it just happened, to examine it, to see, take a closer look at it, oh, there's a nozzle on the end, or it doesn't have eyes, or it's not moving, to say that's not a snake, or to say, oh, I had this opinion about this thing that just happened immediately, but if I look at it a little closely, I think there were things about it I didn't notice at first that I think I need to re-examine. So that's what I think the approach to bias is really, it's really helpful to do, and what a lot of people this day and age really skip over. So let's look at the articles that I picked out. I really wanted to look at some ways that bias, that sense of like snapping to a judgment based on something that's visceral, before you examine it for the facts and for the details. Different ways that manifests. And so there's a million, if you look up types of bias, there's millions of different studies and billions of people who have labeled different kinds of bias, whether it's psychological or social or data driven or research based. So I just picked a few for us to play with. One of them is called survivorship bias. You'll read about it. I don't want to spoil the ending for you, but basically it means that we only really sometimes pull data based on who survived a situation. So we're getting inaccurate results when we only look at the successful outcomes of a situation. And so you'll see what that means when you read it. I won't spoil it for you. The other two are really cognitive bias, mostly confirmation bias. And so that is something that comes up in the law quite a lot, where you come into a situation with a pre-existing notion of what should happen. And you make decisions based on that notion, not having examined it, just knowing sort of somewhere in the back of your mind that you think something should happen based on maybe a snap judgment, maybe that quick like snake in the grass sort of reaction. But if you don't step back and look at it, it can affect the way that your cases work. So there's a private sector a law firm example of that, as well as an Access to Justice Innocence Project example of where confirmation bias comes in. So take a look at those. You know, the idea of studying our biases is really ancient. It goes back to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and even before. They were just the ones that wrote it down and it came to us, but it's not a new concept. The idea that we can't always trust what we perceive at first and that we really need to examine. You may have heard of Plato's allegory of the cave, where he talks about if we lived in a cave that was only lit by firelight and we couldn't get out of it, and the only thing that we could perceive as our reality were the shadows that were cast by the firelight on the walls, we would have a very different perception of what reality was than if we were let out of the cave and we could see everything. And so this is a very ancient idea. It's nothing new, but it's definitely something that as lawyers, we have to make sure that we're paying attention to, because it really will affect, it affects everything. It very famously affects hiring. There are all kinds of studies about, you know, people have done studies where they've changed the names on resumes, and depending on whether a name appears to be from a different culture than the person reading it, they get worse results, even with the same content on the resume. There have been examples of orchestras doing blind auditions where they couldn't tell what the person looked like before they played their instrument for the audition, to the extent that they even had them not wear shoes, so you couldn't tell if they were wearing heels or not. So there's all kinds of ways that we've discovered that pre-existing notions do affect the outcome of certain situations. In law, it definitely affects our case management. Do we plead out? Do we go to trial? How hard do we fight for our client if we think they're going to win or not? Do we take a case or not, based on something that we perceive about our client or their situation? Do we think there's something they should have done? They don't deserve something because of the way they're living their life in some way. The client and witness interviews. So are we asking questions? Are we bringing our own pre-existing biases to an interview with a client where it affects what we do and do not choose to ask them, and what we do and do not choose to believe when they give us information? It affects the data and research that we take on. So if we are looking at our practice overall, say we're examining whether we want to do more outreach to a certain type of client, are we judging properly why clients come in, why they don't come in, where their problems originate from? Is that something that's driven by something that we need more information about, that we're not thinking to get information about because we think we know what's already happening based on our attitude? And obviously this goes into a public policy realm. There are lots of places, if you were to think about you know, bail reform or foreclosure defense, there's lots of public policy that comes in where people's perceptions of the problems of people that are affected by those issues could very much be affected by their knee-jerk reaction to what's going on with that population. So my job is to help you become great lawyers and advocates, okay? I want to give you the tools to do justice, right? And to win cases and to serve your clients the best way possible. If you serve clients the best way possible, you'll get more clients, whether you're making money off of them or not. And so that's my job. And I desperately want to be in an anti-racist society, obviously. And so the roots of these things are all the same. So if we are looking at our biases sort of from a cognitive sense, from an analytical sense, from a strategic sense, that's wonderful. And it is absolutely the same muscle that will keep us also from discriminating against people unfairly and from being racist or otherwise discriminatory. So it's all good. The roots of what the second part of the exercise in the videos is going to be talking about critical thinking, self-regulation, and emotional intelligence. So first of all, read the articles, think of how cognitive bias in some way it might have the potential to affect your work that you're working on right now. I've given you some prompts in the assignment, so that shouldn't be as hard a question as it may sound right now. And after you read them, you'll really think of some things as you're reading. Then the videos go to the self-regulation and emotional intelligence part. So what I mean by that is the practice of getting used to noticing and examining your own reactions. Notice your emotions, decide what to do about them. So in other words, if you have a knee-jerk or visceral reaction to something, think of how it makes you feel. That's the, oh my gosh, there's something green in the grass, right? That's that knee-jerk. Notice that in real life, right? What makes you do that? Stop and notice it. Think about where it comes from. See if it's appropriate or helpful to your situation, right? Sometimes you do see someone that looks threatening to you, and they are threatening to you, right? You take a second, you go, yep, this is a real threat. I need to leave. Sometimes you have a second to say, I saw that person in the wrong light, or I perceived what that person was holding, or whatever. And you think, yeah, no big deal. That was just me, my brain doing that thing. So take a moment, examine what that knee-jerk reaction looked like, okay? Then this is a muscle you can exercise. And that's why we're going to do this short exercise. So I picked out a bunch of videos for you. Okay, they're short videos. Most of them are less than 15 or 20 minutes. There's a couple that are longer, and there's one podcast that's about an hour. Feel free to scrub through those, to scroll through. The podcast has a bunch of banter at the beginning that you can fast forward or watch them at a higher rate. I did want to leave them in their entirety, though, because there's a lot of good stuff in the longer ones, but pick one. Okay, you're welcome to watch them all, but pick one for the assignment. And so really that's all that's required. I would suggest that you pick someone who is different from you, or whose lived experience is something that you have the least knowledge of or familiarity with. I have used a number of labels to describe what the videos are about that I did on purpose. That they're meant to indicate that they are from a particular underrepresented group or protected class, so that you can easily pull out one that you think, even from reading the label, is starting to give you a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, whether it's a, ooh, yuck, and no judgment, or I don't know what that means, or a that's interesting, I have no idea what that person's going to talk about, or a, I can't imagine what that person's life was like. So whatever your knee-jerk reaction is, it doesn't have to be too super negative, it doesn't have to be super positive, but I've labeled them that way to help you start the experience of noticing your first reactions to the person's presentation, their story, and sort of their first impression on you. That's part of the beginning of self-examination. Okay, these are all fairly well-known people. They've all either written books, or they have public-facing lives, or they have an organization. So these are meant to be people that are not just random. Obviously, we could do a whole class on this, so we could dive into many, many more stories, but this is just a few. They all have books. I have made a folder with some follow-up information. Like if they've written a book, I put the link in there. Those are not required in any way. They're really there just for your information, and if you're interested in their story. I've tried to label them so that you can choose one. If you're not comfortable with some of the content, I've tried to tell you if there's going to be explicit language or other triggers. So definitely take a look at those. For right now, I think the idea is putting you for the first time in this class into sort of a mindful state, a state of self-examination. And this isn't the first time I'm going to mention mindfulness, and I don't mean it that we're all going to meditate every hour, but the idea that you are noticing what you're noticing, the idea that you are self-reflecting, and that you are starting to really key into not just sort of going through life blindly and just feeling the feelings and not thinking about them, but really sort of starting to self-examine and be self-regulated about your emotions. We're going to get into mindfulness a little bit more when we do active listening and client interactions. We're also going to do it in self-care, and we're going to touch on it a little bit when we do examination of your strengths. So it comes up, it's very, very helpful, and it's a technique or a mindset that is popular for a reason. It is really helpful, and it doesn't have to be as squishy and touchy-feely as it sounds. It's actually really good for your professional development. So notice what you're noticing. Notice your automatic reaction. And one more thing, it's really important that you do this without judgment of yourself. So as I said, our primitive lizard brain is going to have a knee-jerk reaction. It's going to have an uncontrolled emotional response to certain things, like the hose in the grass. You're not going to beat yourself up for being a bad person because you mistook a hose for a snake at twilight, okay? And you're not going to beat yourself as being a bad person by, having a certain gut visceral reaction to something about what someone says or how they look or the way they present to you. That is just going to happen, and it's based on very complicated things to do with your experience has been in your life, okay? So no judgment, but you must look at it, okay? Just notice your reaction. Note it without judgment. Examine it. Think about, okay, I wonder why I'm thinking that way, right? Notice it. That's the biggest thing. Notice it. Start thinking keep it in mind as you listen to the person's story. Think about whether something in their story changes the way you think. Maybe part of their story is that part where you say, oh, that green tube doesn't have eyes, or it's not moving, or it's not a snake. Something in their story changes your knee-jerk reaction. It may not, okay? It's okay if it doesn't. What's important is that you recognize that you had it and you gave it a chance, okay? You gave the situation a chance to disprove that knee-jerk reaction, or at least examine the knee-jerk reaction. Okay, so see if the facts of the story bear out your reaction. Did it change your reaction? Did you have expectations about the person's story at the beginning that were met or weren't met? Maybe you were super surprised by where you thought this was going to go and it went somewhere else. That's part of your self-reflection as well. So I guess the idea is look at what you're feeling. Think, really, really notice how it changes as we listen, and then note that down. Tell me what that process was like. Your reflections are completely confidential. And I'm only really just going to grade that you did it. I am not making any judgments, grade-wise or otherwise. I'm not going to think a certain way about you. In some ways, I am also exercising the same type of process as I read your reflections, right? I am not judging them. I am just noticing what you are doing and whether you have examined your thought process and whether you've noticed some of your reactions in a thoughtful way and begun to start practicing this muscle of self-regulation. Okay, that's all I want you to do. I want you to be inspired by this practice. I know some of you do this already. This is probably going to be just sort of baby steps for some people and like, nothing to other people. I do this all the time. Okay, let me just say this. I teach this stuff. I have studied it for a long time. I have been in the DEI space for many, many years. I have run, seminars on this. I still have to practice it all the time. Okay, I watched all of these videos to find them for you, and I watched many, many more, and every single one of them taught me something that I didn't know before. Every single one of them made me more prepared to go out into the world and be more understanding, to listen better, to examine my own knee-jerk reactions as I go through life. So I hope that it does the same for you. I hope it inspires you and gives you one more way to practice this muscle that I think we all need to practice more than we do. So that is the idea of this week. Keep practicing. It will make you a better lawyer. It'll make you a better counselor and advocate. It'll make you a better citizen of the world. It'll make you a better friend. It'll make you a better human. So until next week, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing your reactions. If any of you have any other people that you think that I should profile this week, or if you find another video of someone that you want to use, I guess, you know what, use that one and just give me a link to it so I can see which one you used if you're really feeling ambitious. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy this week. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.